to Adam's talk. So Adam is at the Johns Hopkins Medical Center. He's a postdoc research fellow there and at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. He assures me that, I don't know which part is not, the psychedelics or the consciousness. In any case, he has a number of interests, and his ultimate purpose is to explore how individuals can be adaptive, creative, and free in all aspects of their lives. Adam, is that like joining a hippie collective? Anyway, the floor is yours. We look forward to your talk. I'm hoping George will rejoin us. It's too early there, I could make out in Canada.
He sent me a message, says he has to leave, but he's hoping the recordings will be available so he can catch up later.
Yes, he was looking forward to your talk.
Oh, we'll be recording, I think, right? We are recording.
Yes, absolutely. We will be recording and we'll revisit many things, hopefully.
All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so today I will share a few thoughts on the roles of embodiment in constructing integrated models of the world. And I think this will connect to varying degrees to some of what was just discussed. So in trying to reverse engineer human intelligence or just figure out our own intelligence, we have this, challenge of trying to figure out, like, how are we so smart? We're nowhere close to building systems even remotely close to humans in intelligence, with very few learning opportunities based on ambiguous information, sometimes facing ill-posed problems, and within very under-constrained inference spaces, we somehow manage to figure things out with incredible rapidity and robustness. Limited, we can get confused. Our folk notions can sometimes deviate from reality, but it is quite amazing relative to anything that we can engineer. And so what a lot of people are saying is we need some sort of inductive bias, some sort of useful priors within the Bayesian cognitive science paradigm, and within machine learning, they call it inductive biases. But with the biological system, we face a certain challenge trying to port this as an explanation, which is, well, what forms might these evolutionary priors or inductive biases, what forms might they take? Can you do it? Like, what's the complexity of what you can preload into a nervous system? You have this, mismatch of complexity between the genome and the connectome. I don't know how much I want to make of that, but still, the idea that you're having this massively self-organizing system where a lot of the information is not just like complexly a function of what happens, but it's unknowable a priori in a way, because it's going to depend on information that will only be available to the agent as it to the organism as it interacts with the world. And so, like, a lot of the information will determine, like, what neurons mean what will be a function of particular idiosyncratic histories of experience. This isn't to say that there isn't extensive canalization of the phenotype by genes, but the question is, like, what are we looking for? Is this what kind of biases could we have? And we might be very limited. So natural selection might have had, I guess, kind of like fat fingers and the engineering problem of trying to sculpt us in particular ways. So how might biology have handled this? I suggest that the primary way that this was handled by nature was using the body as a prior, or you could say as a source of very reliably learnable posteriors. I think you may never get opportunities for learning that are as well posed and fruitfully constrained as your own body. So you could picture, like, the young infant learning just its hand. It's always there. It feels like something, so it cares. It can move its hand to disambiguate hypotheses. All of the modalities are giving these rich time-varying data streams that are in real time constraining each other. The look, maybe some sound, the feel from without and within, body-body interaction. You're having these massive constraints that you wouldn't get from just like a passive observer, just looking out in the world and trying to infer a world model, infer what's happening and what's out there from there. So as opposed to like the naive Cartesian observer, it's the opposite of that. It's very inactive and very constrained, and I would argue creates a near ideal kind of training wheel system for learning. The first essential lessons in a learning curriculum provided by embodiment. So that's the idea, is that the body could be a source of very useful evolutionary priors. Other people have spoken of some of this, like I'd say Rolf Pfeiffer talked about this very eloquently. Even like the joints of the arm are part of the learning curriculum. The fact that the hand reaches out in front of you and places things for inspection, or the fact that like fingertips are kind of squishy, soft robotic systems that help with control, where a lot of the intelligence is offloaded to the morphology itself. This is further scaffolding and training wheels. It's not clear we're doing things like this in AI, and I would suggest that this might be essential. This might be you might need these kinds of lessons to constrain hypothesis spaces enough that you can actually bootstrap your way to a robust causal world model.
So Adam, can I just, this came in evolutionary terms, the idea of this self comes very much later, I would say, something like 150 million years ago. But there's a group of us, as you well know, I mean, Sylvia Ramon is not here, but she was there last time, and hopefully George, we're saying that there's a precedent for the self. And that was in the adaptive immune system, where at a molecular level, the knowledge of self genes, or the genes when expressed create your morphology and that sort of thing, the organism itself, that needed to be projected somewhere from which you need to make inferences about the other or the external. Sorry, I've got my phone. So why this is like, you're catching the story way further downstream, right? We need to go right back to when the self became integral to all aspects of inference. The embodied self first came about in the adaptive immune system 500 million years ago.
It seems like that would be yet another potential constraint provided on this engineering project that might, I guess, would be upstream of these things I'm talking about. So I guess I'm saying that the Bayesian cognitive science program, the problems of deep learning, just on their own terms, it seems like they need some sort of trick of like, so they'll talk about like, Spelke's core knowledge that we have, but we'll have like objectness, cause, space, time, basically Kantian categories somehow in there, but it's never explained the ways in which they're in there or how, and what their nature is. Like in a biological system, it's just, let there be priors and it was good. But, you could, while we're talking about quasi-Kantian categories, the self, I think Jory's written about this, like referencing like Kant's like transcendental unity of apperception, even like that itself is needed as a kind of inductive bias for world modeling. And so part of this of selfhood would be, you can get some selfhood just from like learning the constraints and affordances of embodiment. The body is a unitary object and causal system that you have asymmetric control over and knowledge of relative to things externally. But even upstream of that, you have like these autonomic and immune, and not just upstream, but continuously interacting, that are probably further essentially important for the construction of selfhood. Basically, grounding it in homeostatic and allostatic considerations. So that's yet another.
No, I totally grant you. I mean, the Bayesian has to have priors, and what better than the embodied self? I mean, get it ready. But the macromolecules that emerged in 500 million years ago with the adaptive immune system are exactly the macromolecules. So we're hoping the next 3 months we will have that, because this was never the case in prokaryote, cells. They never had a concept of the other as a projection of self. So why did it happen? It happened for the homeostasis of having to fight off, the virus. This was part of the problem. And then, of course, at that level, at the level of the adaptive immune system, it, of course, is subpersonal. It's not conscious. But by the time it came into our, central nervous system, the sentient self became apparent. But the macromolecules, so we really, I mean, so I know lots of, this is almost now very few people. Chalmers is an exception, I'm told. He's a dualist, and not these things won't mean very much. He's the only guy who doesn't believe, that it's this embodied self there. He's one of the rare Cartesian relics left, or so I'm told. So, so now it's virtually universal amongst most neuroscientists that they start with the embodied self. So, but I think we need to go, much earlier to find out where that started from. So that's my 2 penny bits.
No, I suspect you're right that like both the mechanisms, the developmental pathways, and the principles of selfhood and agency have this older vintage, and not just. And that this is going to end up being an essential part of the story, both for illustrating the principles and for understanding the ongoing functioning. Something I'd like to explore later would be like the ways in which similar self, non-self discriminations of the kind that are laid down with immunity are reflected, even decoupled from immunity. That's just the same type of problem and challenge of interfacing with a world where some of the dynamics could be challenging to you, or you could face different types of like adversarial attacks to you, and that you have to overcome this in the ways in which this challenge might be overcome in different ways, both by, and basically like ways in which the immune system handling of this might actually be reflected in things like body maps and maybe even continuous with them in terms of understanding, in terms of the ways we model self and world. So I think that's like a really deep rabbit hole. And so like I've been focusing and something I'm still updating on. So I've been like mostly focusing on is trying to basically, from this idea that we handle these inductive challenges by bootstrapping off of embodiment with this learning curriculum. The idea would be that you have this basically developmental legacy from this that makes embodiment the core architectural principle of the brain. And that almost everything in the brain should be basically pegged back to cybernetic control, basically a predictive cybernetic controller for an embodied embedded agent. And so ultimately, what I want is a kind of Marian neurophenomenology where we go from, computational / functional algorithmic and implementational levels, have rich connections across these levels, and then connect these to the phenomenological level. And that this will all be essential, I think, for both understanding the way we work. And I believe ultimately we probably will need to construct systems as intelligent as we are. We might need to build something like an artificial brain. Otherwise the problem space might be too under constrained, and we may flounder there for a very long time. So, and for this bridge, while I've been thinking about different machine learning principles as rather the algorithmic bridge between computational and implementational levels, it seems like within like the free energy principle and active inference, there's some notions of different machine learning architectures that could do things like predictive processing, which could help to map neural systems onto these functions. And I've been exploring that in some of my recent work. And so I guess I don't know if I'll go too much into consciousness. So how much time do we have?
You've got a good 20 minutes with Q&A.
Good 20 minutes? Okay. So I'll just blow through a couple more slides and leave plenty of time for discussion. So so I've been, in terms of like, I actually think if we're going to have systems that can navigate the world and can do things like natural language processing so that they can inherit the cultural endowment, we probably are going to need something like artificial consciousness of the kind, definitely of the kind that like Benjo and LeCun have started talking about in terms of, higher, system 2 properties, or the ability to like reflect and have these different types of awareness of what's going on in terms of a kind of knowledge, and maybe even artificial phenomenal consciousness to provide the basis for certain types of empathic processing, or just maybe as an efficient computational structure for world modeling and body world modeling. I've been specifically working on theories of consciousness by cross-referencing different theories and seeing what intersects between them. And as part of this, I've been claiming that most of these theories, while they have like merit in seeing different sides of this noumenal elephant, so the different sides of like what we're talking about when we mean consciousness, then most of them are begging questions with respect to why we should think of any of them in terms of like experience or what it is like, and that ultimately embodiment is the thing that's missing from most theories of consciousness. And this is a place where we basically, cognitive science and theories of consciousness all are going to come together on what does it take to realize a lived body, to model it and its interactions with the world, such that you can stay on top of these interactions with this world, such that you can both inform and be informed by action perception cycles in processes of sense making and learning. And I argue that this is actually the functional significance of phenomenal consciousness as a kind of modeling of system and world and their interrelation. And I think Georg would find that to be very sympathetic. So
we're dreadfully missing George.
I would hoping to talk to him.
As I said, we had to pick a date. Whoever's there is there. I mean, he's very much involved. We may have another session with George in it sooner than later.
I hope so.
Yeah.
So, in a very, very like broad brushstrokes way, and with devils and details here, I don't want to be glib about this. I think there is a sense in which these types of fictitious stimuli that we see produced by different kinds of generative models, that this is roughly in the ballpark of the entailment relationship we're looking for of a bridge between mind and brain potentially. But the idea would be, instead of filling in like pixel arrays, you would be filling in a multimodal experienced world in different combinations, where the particular combinations of what you fill in would be the contents of your stream of experience. Very broad brushstrokes, many devils and details there, but that's the rough shape of the intuition pump and where I'm going with this. So I proposed a theory I called integrated world modeling theory, saying that basically you need to have quasi-Kantian categories of coherence with respect to space, time, and cause, and maybe a very basic minimal selfhood in order to bring forth a world of experience. So to have a system that can actually model the world robustly, we're going to need things relative to things situated with particular properties. And so for this, we'll likely need space or some kind of locality for the situation, time or relative changes in this space to capture process, and cause or some sort of regularity in these changes such that such changes in phenomena could so be modeled. And we also might need a different kind of minimal selfhood, where some of the principles actually might be continuous with the principles of adaptive immunity, and maybe even mechanistically continuous. And so I've been exploring different machine learning architectures as ways of thinking of predictive processing, specifically if you take certain types of autoencoders and you take them, maybe fold them over, and instead and give them recurrent dynamics, that this could be a decent model for cortex as a predictive processing hierarchy. And then if you stitch multiple hierarchies like this together.
Sorry, can I just press you about predictive processing, right? I mean, I understand exactly why you need to predict various things. In other words, again, going back to the immune system, I mean, the whole thing about self-reference, in my opinion, is not an end in itself at all. Self-reference and the actual mathematics of Gödel and so on, as you know, is to find a means to access open-ended search, in order to actually identify various things in the immune system, is to work out what novel non-self antigen is going to attack your self codes. So we have access, again, going back 500 million years ago, for some, I don't know how those things happen, but the RAG operators, the recombination activation genes, can generate 10 to the power 20 and 30, like there were some billions of trillions of alternative scenarios. But this is done offline. So do you make a distinction between online and offline? I mean, online is whatever the machines run and produce your corporeal self or whatever. And then offline, you have to generate a whole platform where you try out all these hypotheses. So with Carl can't be here today. The whole business about predictive inference is there, because you make hypotheses, and then you test it with your experience, because all of these things that are done in this offline venue is never pre-recorded in your genome. It is not scripted in your genome. That's another thing. It's learned on the fly. I mean, this is the nature of a lot of the learning. It would be far, because the experientially driven stuff is so varied that you could not have pre-recorded in your genes. It's done, outside of this whole thing, everything in the adaptive immune system, or even in things that we do as per learning in the brain, very structured. It's all within. So the predictive coding, in your mind, why do we need to make predictions of things, and then what are we predicting?
So predictive coding, in a way, seems like a multi-scale story that could apply both to neural systems, and there's even been handlings of immunity as a predictive processing system. But in terms of something like handling novelty, there is a kind of fundamental conservativeness of predictive coding as described, of you're explaining away as much as you can to minimize your cumulative precision weighted prediction error. And so it's just inherently on its own, just taken on its own, it's not incorporating things like novelty, but associated with like the free energy principle, there's this process theory of active inference, which acknowledges we need specific mechanisms to do things like forage for new information, to explore the adjacent possible in different ways. But the actual implementations might be quite heterogeneous and not well mappable back to predictive processing. One of the things, though, that connects some of the interests I'm describing is, and consciousness is as a kind of data augmentation / exploration process, where basically imagination, where you would be doing offline these different rollouts of possibilities of varying degrees of plausibility, of varying temperatures of the search, more like conservative, like what am I going to do next? What am I going to eat for lunch? To more impressionistic and dreamlike, and maybe for those like really thorny edge cases, like loosening up your system to be able to handle things that would seem to be improbable to you, entertaining more implausible counterfactual possibilities. But part of what, so the idea is that the predictive processing would be part of a broader architecture for world modeling. And that one of the things you would want with this world modeling process would be to be able to support imaginative rollouts of different ways, of different possibilities. And this would give you basically some ability to, depending on how you do it, handle novelty and learn both offline in terms of you're not in the midst of any task, but even in a kind of like offline way, like even when you're in the midst of it, very brief rollouts, like a driverless car. I'm not saying driverless cars are conscious, but like, they're on the road and then they're entering traffic and they're already doing like these different, like sussing out of possibilities just to make it through. There's already the importance, not just for, offline, it gets, the Tesla's output gets uploaded to the dojo and there you do the training. But even like when it's on the road, it's going to have to be doing some of this exploring of the new, of the uncertain. And so sorry.
So it would be like, it'll have a number of questions, it'll hypothesize, is the light red, green, yellow? So it has to have a number of these predictions or hypotheses, I would say. You're asking various hypotheses, and then you see green, and therefore the hypothesis that it could be green fits with the green. In my book, that's a fixed point. It's not what I mean. Lots of people take it as a prediction error, but I don't see how it could be a prediction error. It can be only red, blue, or green. I mean, red, orange, green, and then you hypothesize any one of those, and then when it is green, it's one of those, and then you take off if you're a self-driving car. So is that how you have it? Is that what you have in mind?
So predictive processing, like it does seem to be a multi-scale story that would apply anywhere from message passing in cortex, potentially to understanding even things like low level, like intracellular processes, even as types of even there, you might be able to tell a predictive processing type story of like minimizing prediction error, where what would being, but the question now is, well, what's being predicted? Within the free energy principle, the word prediction is used like very broadly, but the primary thing being predicted would be the adaptive phenotype of the organism and its relationships with the eco niche. And so if what's being predicted is the organism engaging the kinds of things it needs to do to survive, which would include going out and foraging for information and exploring the unknown, what you end up doing is you're minimizing prediction error with respect to this model of you being in the world adaptable.
I mean,
and so you're not just minimizing prediction error, because otherwise you have this dark room problem where it's just like you're just trying, but which actually I would suggest is like not completely solved, and there's actually some evidence for something like prediction error minimization, that we do often like minimize complexity, sometimes in pathological ways. But in general, when it's the way it's working, right, is the organism is predicting itself, going out and exploring and finding new things, and basically epistemic value is part of like what would be there in like an implicit objective function. And so the expected free energy, the prediction would be with respect to that expectation of you being configured in a way which would be which would involve, I mean, new things.
So Adam, that's all very well. I mean, the issue about what I call some of these thermodynamic models, I mean, Carl seems to think that at all and every level, we just somehow have the wherewithal to do these things. And I keep pointing out in the dark room thing, there are single cell beings that have been, they've never changed for almost billions of years, right? They've been in the dark room. They sort of, batten down the hatches and just live like that. So to do the sorts of things that, we are doing, a lot of structures had to come in the way. This thing called the RAG operators. Without the RAG operators, we wouldn't have any diversity there, right? To test out 10 to the power 20 different alternatives. So wherever, remember you told me about, trying to understand what's the area of this central nervous system where the RAG operators are there in large quantities, apparently is in the hippocampus, because where you need to be generating lots of hypotheses, I suppose. We don't know yet. I mean, so I keep telling Carl, I mean, you have to either talk molecular stuff or, others, we go down the route of a lot of these thermodynamic models where suddenly you have self-organization. And I want to know how. I mean, I don't see any of these things just naturally self-organizing itself. Either there has to be the software or you have give us the wherewithal of how anything became as complex as it did, or it does, or it is. So that is the difference between the hand waving or just assuming it's going to happen.
We need specific mechanisms. Like so there's an assumption that's like normative, almost like a kind of anthropic principle. Like if you exist and you're alive, you had to on some level been able to refine your models by getting new information. So you had to be exploratory. You had to be working at the adjacent possible. You had to have escaped the dark room to somewhat, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But still, that's somewhat hand waving, even though it's also kind of like hard to think of how that couldn't be the case because it's necessary. But now we need the mechanisms. And so once you get, so at the normative process theory of active inference, you say that has to be there. But now you need additional process theories to actually bring in the novelty bonus, to bring in the artificial curiosity. And so things like RAG operators in the hippocampus, that would be like on the table as a potentially fundamental mechanism, especially considering that the hippocampus is the top of the cortical hierarchy, in some ways the highest levels of policy selection for the overall cis agent organism as it moves through time and space. You control these trajectories of overall locomotion through space. That's a very high level of integration at the organismic level. And so if you're injecting novelty right there and connecting it to potentially immunity and selfhood, like there's all sorts of ways you can, rich ways in which many aspects of what you need to be alive and intelligent and exploratory and curious could be put in there, and that could be one of them. this idea of these transposon type elements, or like like shuffling around, creating diversity within the neuron.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This nexus system, that would be a good way to do it. And other ways, and there's likely multiple ways that this is going to be reflected, and that could be a really essential one.
Anindya, I want you to, this is something I read from Adam's paper. No, the turbo coding. Tell us something about his turbo coding, Adam.
So the turbo coding, the idea is like, in order to create something like a world model, part of what you would do is multimodal synthesis. Each modality is giving you a different perspective on things with non-overlapping ambiguities, non-overlapping details, and so you could get synergy across them. And so the question is, well, what's the source of these cross-modal priors? How can we think of them? And so one way you might be able to think about them is you can think of each modality as a kind of noisy channel. And then as you move up these different hierarchies, if you let these channels, if you basically, like association cortex, heavily reentrant, less directed. And so in theory, if the tops of these hierarchies have this intense reentry, this can be thought of as having parallels, I would suggest, with something called turbo coding. Judea Pearl basically called it a loopy belief propagation for approximate inference over graphical models. It's also discovered by what's it? 3G and 4G. Guys. Yeah, French communication. So it's in cryptography, 3G, 4G communications depends on this, and you approach the Shannon limit for efficiency. And so the idea is that nature, in order to pull off multimodal synthesis, part of so you have this rich club of the brain that's stitching together all these hierarchies and taking about 50% of overall metabolism, it seems. So, and a lot of people talk about this as having some conjunction with being like where like the business end of consciousness might be, but also like, well, what are some of the functions of what it's doing? So some of what you might be able to think of it doing on some level of abstraction would be turbo coding, which is giving you a very advanced way of doing multimodal synthesis that approaches the Shannon limit for efficiency. And in general, you would expect nature to, if there is some sort of optimality, and nature could have, it might have found it. Maybe it did here, and this could be a useful way of thinking of cross-modal integration and a way of thinking of.
Sorry, so this is optimality in terms of minimizing your metabolic inputs. Is it
optimality
efficiency in that sense?
So within predictive coding would be optimal in that the better your predictions, the more you can do explaining away, and then you have basically you're minimizing thermodynamic expenditures as well with the minimal activity, but also efficiency in terms of just speed and in terms of data efficiency, like getting quicker to having intelligence, which nature being a world of the quick and the dead, a small marginal improvement in your predictive power and your energy efficiency or in your prediction your action selection, that'll get expanded by differential exponentials, and you should expect this to potentially be discovered if the fitness landscape is nice enough. So yeah, so that's like the turbo coding idea. So that, I've been calling this like the conscious turbo code. So
right. I think we can now sort of, we've only got about 2 minutes left.
Yes. So basically been wondering whether some principles of the brain are understood in terms of geometric deep learning. So this comes back to embodiment, but we can't get into that right here. But coming back to safety, like I with a very poor reception, I presented some of the ideas we were talking about earlier about path dependence, natural language understanding, creating path dependencies that infuse value and intelligence as being coupled. I don't think it was particularly well received, but I made basically the argument I made earlier that you're going to need some degree of human likeness, some degree of something like a kind of empathicness, basically affective and common ground, and substantial degree of common ground of your embedding in the environment. Something like developmental robotics might be an essential part of making our way to AGI. And that's that.
I mean, so many questions, so many new things. Vincent, do you want to add to issues that Adam's raised.
Obviously, I'm just curious, Adam, whether you've have you published something on that last point that obviously is interesting to me that I could read?
So in terms of the roles, I've claimed that embodiments provides for bootstrapping within like a Bayesian cognitive science paradigm. I published that in Entropy with an article called The Radically Embodied Conscious Cybernetic Bayesian Brain. And so that one's like where I get into like the importance of embodiment for like bootstrapping models and how this might be a central architectural principle of the mind. I go later into a little bit into different types of like selfhood and like what we might mean by meta-awareness, like mechanistically what could be important in that. But that's that would be that paper. And then the consciousness ideas article in Frontiers called Integrated World Modeling Theory, and that was in 2020. But in terms of the connection to AGI, not really. That I've been more quiet about that, because people look at you like you're a loon unless you have a certain amount of social currency. Like then you can talk about it. Otherwise, so.
Yes, yeah, I know that risk. Okay, yeah, and I just spotted your paper, so the one you cited, so that I'll have a look at that. Thanks a lot. I think there is something interesting to be said in the direction that you indicate. It's obviously tricky to see where in the argument exactly that bit slots in, so to speak. Where is it where you say you won't get to super intelligence, or is it where if you do get it, what consequences will it have? And so on. I think that's interesting. But of course, the really interesting question, at least for the moment, it seems to me, is exactly what are the conditions for actually getting any kind of machine intelligence that deserves the name properly. And so I think that's obviously something that you are contributing to. So that's really cool stuff. So I'm trying to learn. I sent you another reference in the chat, by the way. Privately to Kevin O'Regan. I don't know whether you probably do know him, but if you don't, then you probably, I'm pretty sure you would like him. He's
radical. Yeah.
Similar things to yours in the EU Cognition Network that I used to organize, where
with
Pfeiffer
a slight
was also
difference.
one of the co-organizers. Well, Pfeiffer that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's actually like his work is like some of the most interesting work out there, I think.
Who's this again? What's his name?
Kevin O'Regan.
Pfeiffer. Oh, yeah,
Rolf Pfeiffer.
O'Regan, sorry, yeah.
But like, so I called like the paper like radically embodied, but like the people who are into radical embodiment would actually not, I think, like what I said, because I argue that basically we want to think of the brain as like, not just like as one principle throughout, but as like, it's a complex architecture. And so like, if you're thinking of like things like different sensory hierarchies, maybe lower down, it is more an activist. And if you're thinking of things like representation and modeling, it might be more of an implicit variety, of an inactive variety of a coupling, like involving the environment and coupling. But I'm also though, like, I think like once we get to these deeper portions of cortex where you can get these basically attractor dynamics that can kick free of the immediate engagement with the world, you have things like bona fide representations. And these are what you would use for things like doing imaginative rollouts and exploring novelty. And so you can do these things all inactively. In fact, nature's been doing it for, hundreds of millions of or billions of years. But the idea would of actually the things you would need for active inference and exploring the new. But the idea that
so Adam, it seems like it looks like to both of us, embodiment and representation are one and the same thing, right? But there are embodiment, people who think they're two different things. So the other day when I was reading David Chalmers, I kept thinking, for me, there are two things happening. There is the machine running and the record of a machine running. And that mapping is what is the important thing. And the mapping then fuses the syntax and the semantics. Because when the machine runs, it is gene expression is semantics. I read a quotation from somebody the other day. And therefore, and then it's mapped offline, and then you have representation. But a lot of people talk about embodiment. I mean, I'm a relative newbie to this. They don't have the representation. They think they're two different things. I mean, Oren Shagir and I were talking about similar, there is now a distinction between these two things, that the people who are in the embodied camp somehow think they're not representational, whereas you and I, Adam, are we not both? I mean,
it's both, and I think there's no clear slot to, like, that's it's like I feel like, in the middle of the road getting hit by both sides. Like
no, exactly. I think
so like, yeah, the world is its own best model, like Brooks was saying. Embodiment is doing a lot of the business that you would want from representation models. But then I also think, though, that
no. I think it is. So I now realize I have a battle on my hands, because when I keep talking about embodied learning and embodied cognition, I'm thinking of the machine running in a code of and the representation, the self-ref and the self-rep. Like Hofstadter said, you have to have both, one running in real time and the other you record it somewhere else. It's a very expensive investment that was made. I mean, George has a whole thing about how expensive this whole offline representational mapping is. Why the hell would you take anything offline and represent it there? So
the endogenous activity is dominating. It's the bulk of the metabolism. It's like the bulk of what's happening is this
offline business,
self-generating activity.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's it doing?
So Rodney Brooks's idea that, what did you say? What did you say that
the world is its own best model, and so there's no need to ever invoke representation or modeling, because just the inactive coupling with the world, that's information. And I think that's right. Like, to the extent that you can offload, that's what's happened. But this imaginative process that lets you do, and all the things you get from it, that's, I think, something additional. And I've among radical people talking about radical embodiment and activists, which I consider myself to be an activist,
are not representationalists.
They say no, and I'd hope for something. I think we can have like a more.
Okay, so we have a battle on our hands, because I'm now finding that what I'm thinking and saying about embodiment is really not meets both things. You have the body and then an exact mapping from there offline. That is the basis of cognition. That's what self-reference is. At least where I come from. But I realize that that's not what a lot of people are thinking when they talk about radical embodied, which you just said, that they just deny any representation and symbolic stuff, right? So anyway, we're hoping that this is just getting people, to be part of our little group, and hopefully, the next time we'll have George in and somebody else, more about the embodied self, because at the end of the day, we have to get that straight, I think. And so we hope to have the whole, it's the same sorts of people, but it's a bit of a what do you call it? The same people who were there last time were not here this time, and then but I think I widened the group a little bit, getting George in, and then there are other people who are also working on similar stuff. So hopefully, maybe end of April we'll have another go at this. So bring in, today, for instance, Stuart Kaufman could have turned up. But I told Stuart he's becoming in his old age a bit nihilistic. He's sort of shooting at all sorts of things nowadays, and I said, we still have to sort of justify our existence and give very deep reasoning about whatever it is that we want to do. But nevertheless, hopefully,
I understand being a little nihilistic, like just hearing like the OpenAI saying like GPT-3 is a little bit conscious, like there's just so many things out there. You're like, or a deep mind. They say like reward is enough, and like we're already on our way. We just need to scale this. We'll get there. Just
that's what I was telling Ravindran. There are these people who say reward is all we need. Love is all we need, and that sort of thing. He says, no, hell, we need some structure.
Yeah,
so hopefully we'll get.
I'm more sympathetic to love is all we need, but but I can understand being a little nihilistic about things. It's ultimately, but this the role of embodiment. Ultimately, I think it's the thing that gives. There's no semantics without it. There's no it's. I think it has to be the common touch point for everything, and to a shocking degree. And so that's part of why I said like radical, even though I know like the term was taken, maybe like surprisingly embodied, the shockingly embodied, the you won't believe how embodied is cybernetic brain. I don't know, but it really does seem like in all these discussions, the roles of embodiment in mind that's the key, that's the Rosetta Stone. And so, like, right now, like, LeCun and Bengio, they're starting to talk about, world models, and, they're on their way, maybe. But unless like unless like the nature of embedding in the world, which is via a kind of body that lets you interface and gives you the content of the common ground. And I would suggest necessary priors in a learning curriculum. I don't think any of it works. I don't think we get to AGI. I think the enduring problems endure, and let alone, we don't get the superintelligence without that. But if that's part of the bootstrap, that would be a deviation from orthogonality, and that would be an opportunity to entangle intelligence and values. It would, because of those path dependencies, those developmental bottlenecks would be part of like a lot of the challenges people are worried about with safety. That's how we would handle them.